The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the quiet street when the man stepped outside to check his mailbox. His mind still calm from a long day's work, he expected the usual stack of flyers, bills, maybe a letter or two. But today was different. Inside the metal box lay a thick envelope, heavier than the rest, its edges sharp, its seal official. His fingers tightened slightly as he pulled it free. The weight alone told him it carried trouble. He walked back slowly up his driveway, his eyes fixed on the bold print across the front. It was marked with the stamp of the HOA. His chest tightened but his face gave nothing away. He tore it open carefully, pulling out page after page filled with dense text. The words leapt out at him immediately: lawsuit, violation, fines, penalties. The accusations were many. Karen, the HOA president, had filed a case against him. Her signature stamped proudly at the bottom of every page. She claimed he had broken multiple community rules, that his property was in violation, that he owed thousands, and worse, that he was a threat to the order of the neighborhood. The man's brow furrowed slightly. But he did not curse, he did not shout. He kept reading silently, line after line twisting further into absurdity. Because the one truth that turned every accusation into a joke was this: his home did not even sit inside the boundaries of their HOA. He was not a member, had never signed their contracts, had never once agreed to their rules. The paper in his hand was nothing but arrogance wrapped in legal ink. Across the street a curtain moved, Karen's sharp eyes peering from her window. She stepped out moments later, dressed in her usual red jacket, clipboard clutched tight like a weapon. Her lips curled into a smile that was not friendly but filled with triumph. She called out loudly so that nearby neighbors could hear, asking if he had enjoyed his mail. She shouted that no one escaped the HOA, that no one defied her rules. Her voice cut through the still air, sharp and proud. Neighbors began to gather in small clusters, whispering among themselves. Some looked worried, some amused, others afraid. They had all seen Karen's power before, how quickly she fined, how ruthlessly she shamed. They wondered if even he, the calm man, could stand against her. Karen's smirk widened when she saw their faces. She lifted her chin high, bragging that soon he would regret ignoring her, that court would strip him of his pride. She waved her clipboard in the air like a victory flag, but the man said nothing. He stood at the edge of his driveway, the papers still in his hand, his eyes calm, his silence heavier than any insult. His neighbors leaned closer to each other, whispering nervously. Was he defeated? Would he fight back? Why was he so quiet? Karen thrived on their whispers, her pride glowing brighter. She told them all she would crush him, that the law was on her side. She announced that the court date was already set, that she would expose him in front of everyone, her voice full of certainty. But beneath her words was a flicker of something else, a small crack of fear she thought she had hidden. The man noticed it. He always noticed. But he did not reveal his thoughts. He only turned slowly, walked back into his house, and closed the door behind him without a word. His silence unsettled the crowd more than shouting ever could. The neighbors lingered, staring at his closed door, then at Karen, who still stood proudly, but whose smile twitched faintly when no one clapped for her. The lawsuit remained in his hands, its pages full of empty threats. But his mind was already sharpening, already piecing together the truth. He knew something Karen had refused to see. Arrogance had blinded her to the law itself. And though she believed she had cornered him, though she imagined the courtroom as her throne, the papers he held would soon be the very chains that dragged her empire down. For now he stayed silent, letting her enjoy her hollow victory, letting the whispers of neighbors feed her pride. Because when the truth came, when the evidence spoke, her laughter would freeze, and her reign would end in the same silence she had mocked. Karen did not waste any time after the lawsuit was delivered. She wanted the entire neighborhood to see her power, to feel her control. So within 2 days she called for a meeting at the community park. She spread the word through emails, notices on doors, and her endless voice ringing across fences. By the evening the place was full. Neighbors gathered in folding chairs, some whispering nervously, others rolling their eyes quietly but still afraid to ignore her. Children played at the edges, their laughter mixing with the tense air. Karen arrived in her red jacket, clipboard in hand as always, walking with the pride of a queen, her eyes scanning the crowd with satisfaction. She climbed onto the small platform at the center and raised the thick lawsuit, papers high in the air, her voice sharp and loud as she declared that she had caught a dangerous man defying their rules. The neighbors gasped softly, turning their eyes toward the calm figure standing at the edge of the crowd. The man had come, his posture straight, his face unreadable, his silence unbroken. He stood with the papers still folded under his arm. Watching, Karen smirked when she saw him, her voice growing even louder. She told everyone that he thought he was above the law. That he believed he could live outside their order. She called him selfish, arrogant, a threat to their community. Her words dripped with venom. She waved the lawsuit in the air again, bragging that the court was already on her side, that soon he would pay thousands in fines, that soon he would regret crossing her. The crowd stirred uneasily, whispers flying. Some wondered how he could fight her. Others doubted her confidence but kept their voices low. Karen thrived on their fear. She mocked him directly, laughing that his silence was proof of guilt. She shouted that he was too weak to defend himself, that he was already broken. Her board members nodded quickly at her side, repeating her words like parrots, their loyalty thin but visible. The man did not move, his eyes steady on her, his calmness making her louder, more frantic. Because she could not stand silence, she fed on reaction, and he gave her none. She stomped her heel against the platform. Her voice rising higher, she read sections of the lawsuit aloud, the legal jargon heavy, but twisted by her tone to sound damning. She exaggerated fines, invented punishments, told the neighbors that the court would strip him of his home, his dignity, even his right to remain in the community. Gasps spread again. But mixed with them were murmurs of doubt. One neighbor whispered that his house wasn't even inside the HOA boundary. Another frowned, saying Karen had always gone too far. Karen caught the whispers, her eyes narrowing. She shouted louder, telling them not to be fooled, calling them cowards if they dared doubt her. Her face red, her pride burning hotter. She turned back toward the man, her finger pointing directly at him, her words sharp as knives. She told him in front of everyone that he would crawl before her, that the court would crush him, that his silence would not save him. But the man remained still. His silence heavier than her shouting, his calmness stronger than her fury. The neighbors stared at him, waiting for him to react. But he gave them nothing, only that cold steady gaze that unsettled even Karen as she laughed too loudly to hide her nerves. She kept speaking, kept bragging, kept digging her own hole deeper. Because every word, every lie, every arrogant boast was heard not only by the neighbors, but would soon be remembered in the courtroom, where truth, not noise, would decide. Karen believed she was winning. She believed her voice could bury him. But in that quiet park, as the crowd listened to her endless noise and compared it to his silence, a shift began, small but certain, doubt growing in their eyes, respect growing in theirs for him. And though no one said it out loud, they felt something she did not. They felt that when the moment of truth came, it would not be her laughter that filled the air, it would be her silence. The courthouse stood tall under the morning sun, its stone steps crowded with people coming and going. But that day there was a strange energy in the air. Whispers ran through the neighborhood like wind, and many of the residents had come, curious to see what would happen when Karen faced the calm man she had dragged to court. Karen arrived first, stepping out of her shiny car with her usual pride, her red jacket spotless, her hair pulled tight, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. She walked up the steps with her lawyer at her side, her heels clicking loudly, her smirk wide as she looked around at the neighbors gathered near the doors. She raised her chin high and announced that today justice would be served, that the law would crush arrogance. She made sure everyone heard. Some neighbors nodded nervously, others looked away, tired of her constant performance. But no one dared speak. Karen thrived on their silence. She believed it was fear, and fear was power. Then, minutes later, the man arrived. No fancy car, no lawyer walking beside him, only his steady steps and a slim folder tucked under his arm. His clothes simple, his expression unreadable. He climbed the steps slowly, not rushing, not trying to match Karen's noise. The crowd shifted, eyes turning to him. Some whispered that he was foolish to come alone. Others whispered that he must have something hidden, something stronger than lawyers and noise. Karen laughed when she saw him, her voice loud, echoing across the stone steps. She shouted to the neighbors that he was weak, that he had no defense, that he would be destroyed in minutes. Her lawyer smirked, adjusting his tie. But the man gave her no glance, no word, only calm steps as he walked past her into the courthouse. His silence pressed against her pride like a cold wind. Inside the courtroom the air was heavy. The judge sat at the front, stern eyes watching as people filled the benches. Many neighbors had come, their faces curious, excited, some almost hopeful. Karen took her seat. Proudly at the plaintiff's table, stacking her papers neatly, whispering loudly to her lawyer about how quickly this would end. Across the room the man sat alone, his folder placed quietly before him, his hands folded, his posture calm. He did not shuffle papers, he did not whisper, he simply waited. Karen leaned toward her board members who had come to support her, telling them to watch closely, to see how easily he would fall. She laughed under her breath, her confidence swelling with every word. When the bailiff called for silence, the room settled. The judge's gavel struck once. The case began. Karen's lawyer stood first, his voice loud, his words polished. He painted the man as a defiant neighbor, a selfish rule-breaker, someone who believed himself above the community. He spoke of fines, of rules, of threats to order. He waved documents in the air, his performance dramatic, meant to impress the judge and the crowd. Karen nodded proudly with every word, her smirk unshaken, her eyes glinting as if victory was already sealed. The neighbors listened, some nodding, some frowning, but most turning their eyes slowly toward the calm figure at the defense table, waiting for his reply. When the lawyer finished, Karen leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed, her smile wide, her voice carrying as she whispered to those behind her that it was over, that he had nothing. But the man did not rise immediately. He waited until the silence stretched, until the room leaned toward him. Then slowly he stood, his folder in his hand. He did not speak loudly. His voice was calm, almost quiet. But the courtroom seemed to lean closer to hear. He began not with anger, not with insults, but with simple facts. He explained calmly that he had never joined the HOA, that his property sat outside their boundary, that no signature bound him to their rules. His words were steady, clear, each one falling heavier than the lawyer's dramatic speech. The judge's eyes sharpened, leaning slightly forward. The neighbors whispered quickly among themselves. Karen's smirk flickered for the first time, her fingers tightening on her clipboard. She whispered harshly to her lawyer. But the man kept speaking, his voice even. He spoke of deeds, of county lines, of property maps. He spoke not as someone defending himself desperately, but as someone who already knew the truth would protect him. His folder still closed, the evidence inside waiting. The silence between his words pressed on Karen harder than any accusation, and though she sat tall, though she smiled and whispered, inside her chest the first chill of fear touched her. The court date she had treated as a victory parade was beginning to feel like something else, something heavier, something she could not control. Karen sat in the courtroom like a queen on her throne, her back straight, her chin lifted, her red jacket bright against the dull wooden benches. Her eyes never left the calm man at the defense table. She studied him with the same look she had given countless neighbors before, a mix of mockery and pride, the kind of look that said she had already won before the battle had even begun. Her lawyer leaned close, whispering quick strategies, but she barely listened, her attention fixed on the man's silence. She mistook his calmness for weakness, his stillness for fear. It fed her arrogance, made her smirk widen as she leaned back comfortably in her chair. The neighbors seated behind her glanced at each other, some uneasy, some annoyed, some whispering softly. They had all seen her arrogance before, but never this large, never so heavy in a courtroom meant for truth. She turned to them briefly, her smile broad, telling them in a loud whisper that the judge would side with her in minutes, that the man would be fined so heavily he would crawl from the courthouse in shame. Her words reached further than she thought, her confidence filling the air. The judge raised an eyebrow at the noise but said nothing yet. Karen's lawyer rose again, his voice booming, presenting charts, lists of so-called violations, photographs of fences, driveways, and lawns, each one meant to paint the man as reckless, irresponsible, and dangerous to the community. Karen nodded along to every word, sometimes clapping her hands softly as if applauding her own brilliance. When the lawyer finished, Karen stood up briefly, asking the judge for permission to speak, her voice sharp. The judge hesitated but allowed her a moment. She turned to the room, her words more like a speech than a statement. She declared that she had been protecting the community for years, that she alone had kept order, that without her, chaos would consume the neighborhood. Her words dripped with pride. She looked at the man and sneered, saying loudly that he thought he was above the rules, that he laughed at the law. Her voice rising with every sentence, until it filled the courtroom like a storm. The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some bowing their heads, others staring at her in disbelief. Her arrogance felt heavier than ever. One neighbor muttered softly that she was embarrassing herself. Another whispered that she sounded less like a president and more like a tyrant. Karen ignored them, her pride deafening. She finished her speech with a flourish, saying the judge had no choice but to punish him. That the HOA's word was law. She sat down quickly, her smirk wide, her breathing heavy, convinced she had delivered the finishing blow. The man did not flinch, his face calm, his eyes steady. He had not spoken a word during her performance, and that silence unsettled her more than she showed. She tapped her nails on the table, glancing at her lawyer for reassurance. But even he looked slightly nervous. The judge cleared his throat, his expression unreadable, his gaze shifting from Karen's proud face to the calm man still standing silently, waiting. The contrast between them filled the room, one loud and boastful, the other quiet and steady, one drowning in arrogance, the other anchored in silence. The neighbors felt it. The board members felt it. Even Karen felt it, though she would never admit. Her arrogance burned brighter to cover the flicker of fear deep inside. She laughed suddenly, a sharp sound breaking the silence, calling out to the man that this was his last chance to beg. Her voice echoing, but he did not move, did not reply. His silence answered louder than any plea. Karen's smirk twitched. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her clipboard, but she covered it quickly, telling herself the judge was already on her side, telling herself that silence could not win against her noise. Her arrogance blinded her to the truth that the courtroom was no longer impressed, that her voice sounded desperate now, not powerful. And as the man prepared to open his folder at last, the balance of power had already shifted, though Karen still believed she was untouchable. She was standing on a throne made of sand, and the tide was already rising. The judge's gavel tapped lightly, calling for order after Karen's loud speech. The courtroom grew still. Neighbors leaned forward, their eyes flicking between Karen's smug smile and the calm figure who had yet to raise his voice. The man rose slowly from his chair, his folder tucked neatly under one arm. He did not rush. He did not clear his throat dramatically. He simply stood straight, his presence alone drawing the eyes of everyone in the room. Karen smirked wider, whispering loudly to her lawyer that he had nothing, that his silence all this time proved his weakness. But the man finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, not loud but clear enough to reach every ear. He began by stating the simplest truth, that his home was not and had never been under the jurisdiction of the HOA. A ripple of murmurs spread across the benches, some neighbors gasping softly, others nodding to each other. The judge lifted his eyes, curious now, his pen pausing above the page. The man continued, explaining quietly that when he bought his property years ago, he had signed no documents binding him to HOA control. His deed held no mention of them. His mortgage carried no reference. His title was clean. His words were not dramatic, but they landed heavy, each one clear, sharp, cutting through the thick air Karen had filled with noise. Karen's face twitched, her smirk cracking slightly. She laughed suddenly, too loud, saying he was lying, that he was twisting words, but her laugh sounded forced. The man ignored her completely, his eyes never leaving the judge. He spoke slowly, every word measured. He said he respected the law, he respected the community. But what he did not respect was the abuse of power. His voice did not rise, but the neighbors shifted in their seats, his words striking them like a quiet hammer. Because they all knew Karen's heavy hand, they all felt her fines, her threats, her control. Karen slammed her clipboard against the table, demanding he stop, shouting that he was trying to manipulate the court. But the judge silenced her with a glance, his attention now fully on the calm man. The man unfolded his folder but did not reveal its contents yet. He spoke instead of principle, of fairness, of truth, saying softly that silence was not weakness, it was patience, that he had endured her threats, her arrogance, her false claims, and that today, he would allow only truth to speak. The room grew heavier with every word. Karen's face burned red, her fists clenched on the table. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The neighbors behind them exchanged glances, whispers of agreement slipping into the air. The judge leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed, his expression no longer neutral but thoughtful. The man paused, his silence stretching, every second making his presence stronger. Then, calmly, he said that he had brought with him the proof, official records, documents that could not be denied. The crowd leaned forward, curiosity and suspense building. Karen snapped loudly that his so-called proof was fake, that he was wasting the court's time, her voice desperate. But the judge cut her off sharply, telling her to remain silent until called. The man stood still, his calm defense already stronger than Karen's storm of words. And, though he had not yet opened his folder, everyone in the courtroom felt it. The tide had shifted. The quiet man who spoke softly, who stood steady, had begun to turn the courtroom against the woman who believed her voice alone could rule. And while Karen still laughed and mocked, deep inside she felt the ground beneath her pride begin to shake. The room was heavy with silence after the man's calm words. All eyes followed as he slowly placed the slim folder on the table, his fingers resting lightly on the cover as if even now he was in no hurry. Karen shifted in her seat, her smirk still clinging to her lips but her eyes betraying unease. Her lawyer leaned close, whispering something urgently, but she brushed him off, her pride refusing to bend. The judge cleared his throat and gestured for the man to proceed. The man opened the folder carefully, sliding out the first set of documents, the sound of paper soft but sharp in the silent courtroom. He lifted them one by one, holding them steady, the county deed first, stamped and sealed, showing clearly the boundary lines of his property. The bold black ink marking that his land sat outside HOA control. He handed it to the bailiff who carried it to the judge. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, studying the lines with careful eyes. Karen laughed suddenly, her voice too high. She shouted that anyone could draw a map, that it proved nothing. But her laughter faltered when the judge's brow furrowed, his pen scratching across the paper as he made notes. The man unfolded the next document. A certified letter from the county clerk's office, dated years ago, confirming that his address had never been registered under the HOA's charter. The seal at the bottom gleamed under the courtroom lights. Official and undeniable. He handed it across, his movements steady, his face calm. Karen slammed her clipboard on the table, shouting that it was fake, that the clerk must have made an error. Her voice cracked halfway. The neighbors behind her whispered louder, some gasping, some shaking their heads. One muttered that they had always wondered why his house seemed different, why Karen never could fully control him. The man pulled out another page, mortgage records, his loan documents, all free of any HOA clause, each stamped and signed by banks, each confirming his independence. Page after page slid across the courtroom, the pile before the judge growing heavier. Each sheet another weight crushing Karen's arrogance. Her lawyer shifted again, wiping his forehead, flipping through his own folder of complaints. But none of them looked half as official, half as powerful. The man's calm voice spoke only when needed, naming each document, naming each seal, his tone steady, his silence between sentences louder than Karen's. Frantic protests, the neighbors leaned forward, their eyes wide, some covering their mouths in shock. They had never seen Karen cornered before, never seen her confidence crack this way. Karen jumped to her feet, her chair screeching across the floor. She shouted that this was all a trick, that he had bribed officials, that he had faked every page, her voice desperate, wild, her smirk gone now, replaced with trembling lips and sweat on her forehead. The judge banged his gavel sharply, ordering her to sit, his voice stern. Her body froze, her pride shaking under the weight of authority she could not control. Slowly she sank back into her chair, her fists clenched tight around her clipboard. The man laid down the final paper, an official boundary survey from the city records office, its lines clear, its notes detailed, every measurement marked, the surveyor's signature bold at the bottom. It confirmed once and for all that his mansion sat on land outside the HOA, untouchable by their rules. The judge read it slowly, carefully, the room silent except for the sound of pages turning. Then the judge leaned back in his chair, his face stern, his eyes locking on Karen. The neighbors felt the shift instantly. The tide had turned, the evidence too strong, the truth too heavy. Karen's mouth opened but no words came, her throat dry, her arrogance cracking like glass. Her lawyer lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. The man gathered his folder calmly, sliding the papers back. Inside, his silence complete, his calmness unshaken, the hidden evidence had been revealed. And it was more powerful than all of Karen's shouting, more final than all of her threats. She had wanted a courtroom to showcase her power, but instead it had become the stage where her empire of noise collapsed under the quiet weight of truth. The judge placed the survey paper down slowly, his glasses sliding to the tip of his nose as he looked over the courtroom, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. The silence was so heavy even the neighbors in the back row leaned forward without breathing. Then his gaze shifted to Karen, his voice calm but cold as he asked her the first question. Why did you file a lawsuit against a man whose property is not listed under your HOA? The words struck like a hammer. Karen froze, her mouth opening but nothing coming out. The smirk she had worn since entering the courthouse began to falter. She forced a laugh, high-pitched and hollow, saying the county records must be wrong, that her HOA had always managed his property, that everyone in the community knew it. The judge raised a brow, unimpressed. He asked again, sharper this time, "Did you verify the boundaries before filing this case?" Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his hand tugging at his collar. Karen stammered quickly that she didn't need to, that she had been president for years and knew the lines better than anyone. Her words rushed, desperate. The neighbors behind her exchanged looks, some covering their mouths, some shaking their heads. The judge leaned forward, tapping his pen against the papers. He asked her why her name was on HOA documents found on the man's desk inside his house, why her personal files were saved on his computer, why witnesses had seen her car near his mansion. Karen's face burned red, sweat rolling down her temples. She stuttered again, claiming she had only been protecting the property, that she had been keeping watch for the community. Her voice cracked mid-sentence. The judge's eyes narrowed further. He asked why groceries, clothing, and personal belongings linked to her were found inside the man's home. His tone cutting sharper now. Karen's hands trembled as she gripped her clipboard. Her laugh forced as she claimed squatters must have brought them, that she was being framed, but her excuses sounded weak, her words hollow. The neighbors whispered louder, some muttering openly now that she was lying. The judge lifted the county deed, the survey map, the certified letters. He asked her if she could provide a single legal document proving his property was under HOA jurisdiction. Karen's lips moved but no sound came. Her lawyer cleared his throat, flipping through his folder nervously, pulling out papers that looked flimsy compared to the official records on the judge's desk. The judge cut him off, his gavel tapping once, his voice rising. "Answer the question, Madam President." The title carried weight, but sounded mocking now in the silence. Karen stuttered, her voice trembling. She admitted finally that she had no such document. Her words quiet, almost swallowed by the silence. The neighbors gasped, some murmuring louder. One man whispered that she had lied to them all for years. Another muttered angrily that he had paid thousands in fines for nothing. The judge's gaze hardened, his next question heavier than the last. "Did you knowingly abuse your position to target this man?" Karen's eyes widened, her face drained of color. She shook her head violently, shouting no, her voice breaking. She claimed she only wanted to protect the neighborhood, her tone shrill, desperate, her words crashing over each other. The judge let the noise die, then asked the final blow. "Or is it true, Mrs. Karen, that you used your authority to control what you could not own?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Karen's hands shook, her mouth opened, but no answer came. The crowd of neighbors broke into whispers, some gasping, some chuckling bitterly, some outright calling her a fraud. Karen shouted at them to shut up, tears glistening in her eyes, but her voice carried no power anymore. The judge leaned back, his face stern, his pen scratching across the page as he wrote. Karen sat frozen, her pride shattered, her lies stripped away. The man remained standing silently at his table, his face calm, his silence unbroken, his presence heavy, and though he had spoken few words, though he had only offered evidence and truth, it was his silence that made Karen unravel under the judge's questions, his silence that exposed her arrogance, and his silence that made the courtroom feel already decided. The courtroom had grown so still that even the sound of the judge's pen scratching against paper felt louder than Karen's shallow breathing. Her once proud shoulders were hunched now, her fingers clutched the edge of her clipboard like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. The neighbors behind her whispered openly, no longer afraid of her glare, no longer silenced by her threats. Some shook their heads in disgust. Others smirked at the sight of the woman who had ruled them for years now trembling before a judge. The man stood quietly at his table, his folder closed, his eyes calm. He did not smile, he did not gloat. He simply let silence do the work. Karen suddenly jumped to her feet, her chair scraping loudly across the floor. She pointed at him with a trembling hand, her voice shrill as she screamed that this was all a setup, that he had bribed officials, forged documents, fooled the judge. She shouted that the neighbors were blind if they couldn't see the trick. Her voice cracked halfway, the sound sharp and desperate. The judge banged his gavel once, the sound echoing like thunder, ordering her to sit down, but Karen refused. Her pride clung to her like fire. She shouted louder, her face red, her eyes wild, saying she was the president, that she could not be humiliated like this. But every word only dug her hole deeper. Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering harshly for her to stop, his face pale with embarrassment. But Karen yanked her arm away, screaming even louder that she had built the HOA, that no one could dissolve it. Her voice cracked again, sweat shining on her forehead, her knees trembling visibly. The judge's eyes hardened, his voice sharp as he warned her that another outburst would find her held in contempt. Karen's lips trembled. She collapsed back into her chair, tears stinging her eyes. The neighbors murmured louder, some laughing softly, some muttering bitterly about all the fines she had given them, all the times she had belittled them. One woman whispered that this was karma. Another man muttered that she was finally tasting her own medicine. Karen heard them, their words stabbing her pride deeper. She shouted suddenly at the crowd, calling them ungrateful, weak, pathetic, her voice shaking so badly that it sounded more like begging than commanding. The judge silenced her again, his gavel striking harder, his tone like iron. He declared that the evidence was overwhelming, that the lawsuit had no merit, and that it appeared to the court that the HOA had abused its authority. Karen's face drained of color, her mouth fell open, her clipboard slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. The neighbors gasped, some clapped quietly, others sighed with relief. Karen shook her head violently, saying no, 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 her voice breaking into sobs. She begged the judge to reconsider. She begged for another chance. But her words were hollow, empty, drowned out by the murmurs of victory from the crowd. Her lawyer sank lower in his seat, unwilling to meet her eyes. The man remained standing calmly, his silence unbroken, his presence steady as stone. Karen buried her face in her hands. Her once proud figure collapsed into a trembling shell, her reign crumbling piece by piece in front of everyone she had once controlled. The courtroom no longer belonged to her. The neighbors no longer belonged to her. Her power had collapsed completely, and all that remained was her broken pride, her empty voice, and the silence of the man who had defeated her without ever needing to shout. The judge sat back in his chair, his eyes sweeping slowly over the courtroom. The evidence stacked neatly before him, the county maps, the mortgage records, the survey documents, all clear, all undeniable. The silence was so heavy that even the neighbors sitting in the back row stopped whispering. They held their breath, waiting for the gavel to fall. Karen sat frozen in her chair, her red jacket wrinkled, her hair messy now, her hands trembling against her knees. Her clipboard lay forgotten on the floor where it had slipped earlier. Her lawyer sat stiff, his eyes downcast, his tie crooked, his face pale. The man remained standing quietly, his folder closed again, his eyes steady on the judge, his calmness unshaken. The judge cleared his throat, his voice deep, steady, sharp. He announced that after reviewing all the documents presented, the court found the lawsuit invalid. His words struck like a blade. Karen gasped loudly, shaking her head, whispering no again and again. The neighbors erupted into murmurs, some gasping in shock, some laughing softly. The judge continued, saying the man's property was not and had never been under HOA jurisdiction. Therefore no HOA fines or rules could be enforced on him. Karen's lips trembled. She shouted suddenly, her voice cracking, begging the judge to listen to her, saying he was making a mistake, her words desperate, her eyes wide with panic. But the judge's gavel struck hard against the bench, silencing her instantly. The sound echoed like thunder. His voice rose louder, firmer. He said this case was not only dismissed, but upon review of the abuse of power demonstrated, the HOA itself was to be dissolved. The courtroom exploded, neighbors gasped. Some clapped loudly despite the bailiff's warning. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. The board members who had sat behind Karen sank low in their seats, avoiding each other's eyes. Karen's face turned white as chalk. Her mouth opened but no sound came. She slumped back against the chair, her body trembling. The neighbors whispered to each other, their voices filled with relief. Some saying it was about time, some laughing that they were finally free. One man muttered angrily that Karen had drained him with years of fines. Now she had nothing. The judge slammed his gavel one final time, the echo shaking the room, his voice sharp, declaring the HOA dissolved effective immediately. The courtroom erupted again, cheers mixing with laughter. Karen's tears spilled, her face twisted with disbelief and humiliation. She shouted desperately that it wasn't fair, that she was the president, that she had power, but no one listened anymore. Her words drowned under the sound of neighbors celebrating. Her lawyer packed his bag quietly, his face blank, ready to leave her behind. The man stood still, silent as ever, his calmness more powerful than all the noise around him. Karen turned her wild eyes on him, pointing a trembling finger, screaming that it was his fault, that he had destroyed everything, her voice shrill, broken. But he did not answer. His silence cut deeper than any words. Her screams faded into sobs, her pride broken, her empire shattered. The neighbors no longer feared her. The court no longer respected her. The judge had ended her reign with a single strike of the gavel. The final blow delivered not by noise or threats, but by truth and silence. Karen sat hunched, her shoulders shaking, her crown of arrogance turned to dust, and the man, calm and silent, stood taller than ever, his victory sealed without him needing to raise his voice. The gavel's echo still hung in the air when the bailiff called for order, but the courtroom had already broken into murmurs and low cheers, neighbors whispering with relief, some even smiling for the first time in years. Karen sat motionless in her chair, her red jacket wrinkled, her shoulders slumped, her eyes wide with disbelief. The words HOA dissolved rang in her head like thunder. The power she had clung to for so long was gone in an instant. Her clipboard still lay on the floor where it had fallen, ignored, useless. Her lawyer quietly closed his bag, refusing to meet her eyes, and slipped away through the side door, leaving her alone, abandoned at the very table where she had once bragged victory was certain. The neighbors whispered louder now, some shaking their heads, some laughing. Quietly, one muttered bitterly that all the years of fines had ended in a single moment. Another whispered that justice had finally been served. Karen's lips trembled. She whispered to herself over and over that it wasn't fair, that the judge was wrong. But her words were weak, her voice broken. Across the room the man stood tall, his folder tucked under his arm, his face calm as stone. He had not celebrated, had not cheered. He simply stood in silence, his eyes steady, his presence heavy. Karen turned toward him suddenly, her eyes wild, tears streaking her face. She pointed at him with a shaking hand and shouted that he had destroyed everything. Her voice cracked, desperate, shrill. But he did not flinch, he did not reply. His silence cut deeper than any insult. The neighbors stared, some smirking at her collapse, others looking with respect at him. Because they all understood now, it was his patience, his silence, his calmness that had ended her reign. The bailiff ordered everyone to leave. The judge stepped away, and the courtroom emptied slowly, neighbors filing out in small groups, their voices buzzing with excitement. They glanced back at Karen, hunched and broken, and then at the man, who walked slowly down the aisle, his steps steady, his silence unbroken. Outside on the courthouse steps the crowd gathered again. The air alive with whispers and laughter. People spoke freely now, saying the nightmare was over, saying they were free at last. Karen stumbled out moments later, her face pale, her hair disheveled, her eyes darting around as neighbors turned to watch her. She tried to shout at them, calling them traitors, calling them ungrateful, but her voice cracked, her words drowned by their murmurs. Her red jacket no longer looked like a symbol of authority. It looked like a costume torn apart. She froze when she saw the man walking calmly through the crowd, his head held high, his face unreadable. The neighbors stepped aside for him, their eyes following, their whispers soft with respect. He did not look at Karen. He did not need to. His silence already louder than anything she could scream. She staggered backward, her body trembling, tears running freely now, her empire gone, her power dissolved. The neighbors turned their backs on her, some laughing, some ignoring her completely. She was no longer feared, no longer obeyed. She was nothing more than noise. The man reached the bottom of the steps, paused once, and looked out across the street, his eyes calm, steady. Then he walked away without a word, his silence a victory louder than cheers. The neighbors watched him go, their fear of Karen gone forever, their respect for him sealed forever. And though he said nothing, though he offered no speech, his silence became the story they would carry, the legend they would whisper, that the man who never raised his voice had destroyed the queen of noise, that truth and patience had shattered arrogance. Karen sank to the steps. Behind them, sobbing into her hands, ignored by the people she once ruled, while the man disappeared into the quiet evening, his silent victory echoing through every corner of the neighborhood that was finally free.